Edifice of Trust podcast. The Edifice of Trust podcast is a thoughtful discussion of today's current events from the perspective of America's founding principles. Welcome from heart-pumping music to head-thumping commentary. Today we're going to be discussing the unfairness of fairness. At the recently concluded NATO conference in Brussels, President Trump did a tour de force of performance art, criticizing allies in public and shaming them for being so unfair to the United States. Only 5 of the 29 NATO nations spend the obligatory 2% of GDP on defense, while the United States spends around 3.5%, spending more for defending Europe than they do, while Europe takes advantage of the U.S. by running a huge trade surplus with the U.S. President Trump got on Twitter and texted, "The European Union makes it impossible for our farmers and workers and companies to do business in Europe. U.S. has a $151 billion trade deficit. And then they want us to happily defend them through NATO and nicely pay for it. Just doesn't work." He wrote that in July 10th, 2018. When President Trump announced a press conference after a potentially contentious emergency meeting of NATO, everyone thought he might announce the U.S. withdrawal from the defense group. Instead, he announced continued U.S. support for NATO and praised the promised increase of financial support for NATO to come from the European members. Another crisis solved. Of course, it was a crisis that he created. President Trump is very unpredictable. One wonders, at least I wonder, if he would actually do some of the crazy things he says he is considering doing. I actually think he would have broken up NATO if the Europeans hadn't stepped up their defense spending, and he may yet if they don't follow up on their promises. Why? Because President Trump believes our current relationship with Europe is very unfair. He also thought the G7 was unfair to the U.S. He believes that NAFTA is unfair to the U.S. and threatens to scrap it if things aren't changed. He thought the Trans-Pacific Partnership was unfair and withdrew from negotiations. In fact, if you think about it, practically all of President Trump's policy initiatives are based on his sense of fairness, and his most ardent supporters agree with him about the unfairness of what is going on in America. It is ironic. The most fervent adherents of the Trump resistance are driven to paroxysms of outrage at the unfairness of his proposed policies. The core of the progressive left's policies is the fight against unfairness. They fight against income inequality, unequal outcomes, the border wall. The only topic they agree with the administration about is President Trump's tariffs, because they agree that foreign trade has been unfair. How can this be? How is it possible that two diametrically opposed factions that are so fiercely inimical against each other actually have the identical concept as their principal objective? Fairness. The explanation is that fairness is subjective, very subjective. It's visceral, it's instinctive. Our sense of fairness is honed in our infancy. It is an infantile response to a situation where reason would be better applied. It is why Trumpers and never-Trumpers are so ready to resort to violence to support their positions, because reason and discussion have no place when fairness is involved. This is why President Trump would dump NATO and scrap NAFTA, because they seem unfair, even though reason would suggest that the problem is not that simple. This is also why the progressive left would abandon basic American principles of personal liberty and the free market economy in order to impose a, quote, fair, unquote, distribution of income and wealth, even though all previous attempts to do so have failed miserably. This is because fairness is not an appropriate standard for developing public policies. Whatever the policy, it will be fair to some and unfair to others. There is no Socratic ideal of fairness. In the past, I have proposed the standard of, quote, not too unfair, unquote, and here propose it again. Any public policy that is perceived as fair by some will be perceived as unfair by others. But all sides can agree that some public policies are not too unfair, and that because of not being too unfair, they are acceptable. Not ideal, but acceptable. Fairness resides in the gut, not the brain. When people feel they are being treated unfairly, they don't say, let's discuss it. They get angry. They get red in the face. Their adrenaline starts pumping and their blood pressure rises. These are not conditions conducive to reaching a mutually agreeable result. When asked to consider a proposal as to whether it is not too unfair, a person would say, well, I need to think about that. This moves the evaluation from the gut to the brain. The whole process of the advancement of civilization has been one of exchanging emotion for reason, converting tribal vendettas into parliamentary discussions. The Enlightenment concept of the social contract and representative democracy is based on reason. And when America has not lived up to its founding principles, it has been because of subjective emotion and not because of reason. The parlous state of 21st century politics is based on emotions stirred by striving for impossible fairness. This emotion is dragging us into the gutter, and not to the city on the hill. If all the politicians of all stripes would strike the word fair and its impossible ideal from their policy proposals, we might actually be able to discuss our problems civilly and come to an agreement. Stay tuned for a brief announcement. Don't forget, my latest book, 2017, A Trumpian Year in Review, is now available in paperback and ebook versions on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and iBooks. Also available are my previous publications, Principled Policy and Edifice of Trust. And if you want some adventure, try my novel, Tawantinsuyu. More information on these books, plus links to retail outlets, is available on my website, www.edificeoftrust.com. Thank you. Welcome back. The problem with, quote, fair, unquote, policies is that they must be applied using force and coercion. You might believe that affirmative action, for example, is a fine, fair policy, but it took the force of government to implement affirmative action. If you don't believe that affirmative action was a good idea, too bad. Whenever a desired outcome is imposed, it takes force to implement. It's like putting a square peg in a round hole. Round pegs think the round hole is perfect. Square pegs not so much. This is why progressives favor a powerful government. Their policies would never be adopted voluntarily. Force is required. This is the essence of socialism and communism. Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital because he thought the proletariat was being treated unfairly. He also favored the dictatorship of the proletariat to impose communism and collectivism on the people. Millions died for fairness. Thank you. Thanks for listening to my podcast. If you would like to hear more Edifice of Trust podcasts, please don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.